Hej allihopa och välkommen till min video om australiska tarantulas. Jag hoppas att alla gillar videon. Tack så mycket.
Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Borlini and I'll just start off this video with a bit of an introduction about myself.
And I would like to also mention my cousin Stephen Tucky. This film wouldn't be possible without him. We have both been into reptiles since I can remember, mostly into venomous snakes. However, we have a huge passion for tarantulas. In the early days, we used to collect tarantulas as they were hard to source. Fortunately, now there are many bred in captivity, and this has led to better protections for wild ones to prevent over-collecting. My cousin Steve learned a lot breeding them, so most of my information comes from Stephen, so this video would be impossible without his input. These days, we do not keep any tarantulas, as we prefer to observe them out in the wild.
But for now we are just focusing on editing reptile videos for YouTube and teaching people about Australian flora and fauna, just like our Aussie tarantulas. Because we both think they're really interesting invertebrates, especially when compared to the rest of the world's tarantulas. So Steve and I grew up in Perth in Western Australia, and we gained most of our knowledge from tarantulas in Australia just by exploring Australia and looking for reptiles. We would come across tarantula burrows all the time. However, there are no tarantulas in Perth itself. There are tarantulas in Western Australia, but the best state to find tarantulas in Australia is in Queensland. And we actually now both currently live in tropical North Queensland, near Cairns.
But it isn't too far to go over the mountain range, and as you head more inland, you start to get the more arid species, like Selena Tippus tarantulas.
Now, when we were younger, we believed that these spiders were called bird-eating spiders or whistling spiders. But it wasn't till our teenage years that we started seeing these spiders, these bird-eating spiders, pop up in the pet trade. And then we realised, wait a second, Australia has Theraphossidae spiders. We have tarantulas, just like the ones in the American pet trade. So that inspired me and Steve to go look for all these species, and what an adventure it was. We found so many species. I would also like to mention before this film goes on that I use the word tease a lot. That's just slang for tarantulas in the tarantula hobby. Here are just some listed here, the 5 genus. One of them we haven't found, the rattlesnake tarantula. It is found in remote central Queensland, and this species is newly discovered. A lot more information for that to come, hopefully. There's only a rare few photos out there. So Steve and I, we know a lot about tarantulas. I wouldn't say we're experts or we're scientists on them, so some of the information could be wrong. A lot of this information on Australian tarantulas is relatively new. So yeah, there isn't too much information on the Australian tarantulas. So Steve and I went around looking for different populations and the famous ones in the hobbies just to learn a bit more about them. Now I've finally introduced myself and Stephen, let's get into the actual photos of the tarantulas and the footage. Start off with the first tarantula. I don't know how to pronounce this one, but we just call them Pygmy tarantulas or tropics, but here's the actual family name here. There is only one species, and you get it in the tropical North Queensland rainforests. It's only endemic to a pretty small area. However, it is fairly common where it lives. And here we can see one just pre-molt. It's about to molt when they go that brown colour. Now, Pygmy tarantulas are a great name for this spider because they don't get very big at all. They're really cool in the hobby as pets because they don't get like ginormous scary like the other tarantulas. Very small. Like these are full grown adults. They don't get much bigger than this. Probably like, 6 centimeters. Very small. I think they're Australia's smallest tarantula. And now we move on to the main tarantula that's in the hobby, the Phlogis or Phlogis. Quite a few species of these tarantulas, and they're mostly found in tropical North Queensland. There are some found in southern Queensland, a bit more hardier. And these tarantulas get ginormous. They're some of the biggest in Australia, and they're prolific webbers. Usually every Phlogis or Phlogis is a heavy webber, so that's a good way to find them in the rainforest. If you see a thick netting of webs on the ground floor, it's usually one of these. Here's an example of some strange naming. They call this PQ113, which is a blue leg. That's just labelling Australian tarantulas, just a number really. Here's a ruby setter from, I believe they're from Townsville. These spiders can get really nice red colours. Most Australian tarantulas have this typical standard brown. Next up we have the rattlesnake tarantula, new to science, and it's got given that name because it sounds like a rattlesnake when it's disturbed. Now these spiders live like really remote black soil sort of floodplain area in central Queensland, so they're one of the rarer tarantulas to find. So me and Steve, hopefully we luck out one day and we see one out there. These spiders are pretty interesting. They're found mostly Australia wide. More of an arid tarantula. They're very hardy. They can be very quick and they can be very aggressive. And there's quite a few species of Selena Tippus, probably a lot that haven't been described. These species are quick to rear up and be defensive. I think it's just because of their hostile environment. They learnt to be more defensive because they probably have more predators, I'm not too sure. Now, these spiders usually have some of the deepest burrows because they live in some of the hottest areas, and usually the burrows are about 1.5 meters deep, we found, which is fairly deep, and if we can't noodle a spider out, it takes a long time to dig it out, especially in the sweltering Australian heat. It's really not that fun, so if we can get them out with a noodle, it's all good. And finally, we have my favourite family of tarantulas in Australia, the Selena Tippus. The reason why they're my favourite is just because they got awesome colours on them, sometimes orangish, and they can be very hairy tarantulas at times, similar to the American New World tarantulas. In Australia, our tarantulas are Old World. So I'll just explain quickly Old and New World tarantulas. Basically, Old World tarantulas are Asia, Africa, Australia and Europe, I believe, which is the Eastern Hemisphere, while the New World tarantulas are in the Western Hemisphere, and that is the Americas, so USA and South America. Now, the reason for this description is because the tarantulas are quite different in habits, such as our Australian tarantulas can whistle, just like a lot of Old World tarantulas can. So now we've talked about all the species, let's get into what they're like in the hobby, keeping them. Steve and I used to keep our tarantulas in these large plastic tubs that we just got from the local hardware store. Visually it's not that good, but it does the job. It's really great for keeping larger tarantulas. And we got to make sure we mist them because especially the Phlogis and the rainforest species, they really like that water.
But be careful not to overwater, as this can create mold issues. Don't forget, a lot of arid tarantulas live in a harsh, dry environment. In this case, we use a lid filled with pebbles so they don't drown in it. We do find though the tarantulas like to burrow underneath the lid and knock it over. This is why we usually just spray the enclosure.
But if we want a great display with younger tarantulas, like slings they're called, baby tarantulas, we use these old coffee jars. And here I'm just explaining how I take the plastic bit off the top, and then I just poke some holes in it, so there's some airflow, and I poke quite a few more holes than this, just so they get enough air. And that just makes the perfect display for your small tarantulas. And you can see all the network of burrows. Here we got a tarantula that's a bit too big for this jar, but that's a blue Phlogis crucipes. This is just actually a blurry photo, when in fact when you're looking at the jar in real life it's very clear and see-through. It's just perfect for keeping smaller spiders. This tarantula's, getting a bit too big, and I think I removed it to one of the tubs shortly after this photo was taken. This South Queensland Phlogis actually just molted here in this photo, and it's got that amazing blue colour to it. I wish I got a better photo. And I used this cocoa peat, this coconut bark, and just make sure it's reptile safe, because some of the brands aren't. We use this with every enclosure, and we make sure it's deep enough so they can burrow. We also use some of the sphagnum moss to help retain the moisture. Alright, searching in the wild, and their burrows.
So we find searching for tarantulas in the wild, the best way to find them is looking through rubbish actually. And especially the rainforest tarantulas, we find that 90% of the ones we do find are under corrugated iron bits of tin that people have dumped or it's part of an old settlement building. The first thing we're looking for is webbing. We lift up the tin, try to find that webbing, and then we can spot the spider. So that's the best way to find the rainforest ones. But what about the arid spiders that don't really web at all? Here is an example of a Selena Tippus burrow, and you can barely see any webbing. The way we find these is just walking around habitat and getting the eye to spot these burrows. Eventually, you start spotting more and more the more you get used to looking for these burrows. Then once we found the burrow, how do we get the spider out the burrow? Well, we use a technique called noodling, where you use a piece of straw or a stick or something really fine and soft, and we gently tap the web to make it feel like another spider's approaching or its prey. Now the spider will gently come out just like this Selena Tippus is doing here, and someone puts a spoon behind its abdomen so it can't go back in. Now if this method doesn't work, it can usually take about an hour to dig up these burrows. So every time we come across a burrow, we hope this method works. Here, this Selena Tippus is actually using an old crab burrow, a land crab burrow. Sometimes tarantulas will do this, and they will use old animal burrows to make it easier for them to create their own burrow. So they'll literally steal another animal's burrow. Happens sometimes, but usually the tarantula will dig its own burrow. So I have noodled this Selena Tippus Phlogis, and you can just see its legs sticking out. So there's actually a good tip for some of you tarantula keepers out there, that if you actually start a burrow where you want your tarantula to burrow, say push it down with your finger, the tarantula will actually find that path of easiest way to go, basically, easiest way to dig, and it'll actually start digging there so you can control where you want your tarantula to dig. Usually this works about, 80% of the time I found. Generally, Aussie teas prefer not to bite, but if annoyed they can inflict a very painful bite. The fangs are just as long as our deadly venomous snakes. Vomiting and fever-like symptoms such as sweating have been recorded. I had a friend once tell me when he got bit he felt very nauseous and sat in a cold shower for hours just to keep cool. You can handle them, and many people do. There are actually a lot of videos on YouTube of people handling them very gently, or they just have a very calm individual. But don't say I didn't warn you. If you get bitten, you may need a trip to the hospital, or even worse, have a severe allergic reaction. This is why we prefer not to handle them. In terms of behaviour, tarantulas can show many different moods. This curl, for instance, is a sign the tarantula is scared, sick, or in most cases, it's just cleaning itself. If it is doing this, but it's on its back, leave it alone, because it's most likely not dead, but it's shedding or molting. A very vulnerable time for the spider. If a tarantula is overextended in a curl, and it just looks weak or very strange, it probably is dead. This is called the death curl. The T in this pic is very much well alive, it's just scared of the camera as we're trying to film it. Tarantulas molt around every 6 months, but it really depends on how fast it is growing, and the species. Phlogis, for instance, grow quite fast, while Selena Tippus grow very, very slowly. When a spider is seen wandering around its enclosure, this can mean a lot of things, like it wants to mate, it's hungry, or maybe it's just been a warm day and come night time it has brought on activities such as cleaning its burrow or wanting to explore. For a keeper, this is the best time to observe the tarantula as they are fully stretched out. For some keepers, this can be also nervous times. Has anyone else ever witnessed a tarantula pushing a lid open? They are very strong, so a secure lid is a must. Also, an enclosure that is too high can be very dangerous for Aussie tarantulas because they are terrestrial, but still amazing climbers. So try to avoid making an enclosure where they can climb too high, or they can risk fall damage.
Your local vet probably won't want to help a venomous tarantula, but if injury does occur, there are a few steps you can take to help. Superglue or liquid band-aid can stop bleeding, but in most cases, if you just leave the tarantula alone, it will actually grow back its legs after the next molt. But Steve has witnessed this, and they come back just as good as new. Another type of behaviour is the happy "I've just caught food" stance, where the spider is fully spread out. When the spider's caught its prey, it wiggles its abdomen, shaking its butt up and down. The spider isn't exactly dancing, but it's webbing tripwires around the entrance of its burrow. I believe this behaviour is because it's happy there is food around its burrow, so it knows it's a good spot to make more webs. Do you know why they do this? When a tarantula is seen with its front legs sticking out its burrow, this usually means they're in ambush, waiting for something to come past for a good meal. Sometimes, when a T isn't hungry, molting, laying an egg sac, or at risk of its burrow being flooded in the wild, they will block the entrance of the burrow with webbing and dirt. When you see this, this is your tarantula's way of saying, "Leave me alone." They can do this for weeks on end. There have been so many times I've tried to impress my mates with tarantulas, only to show them a sad, empty looking enclosure, but hey, that's tarantula keeping for you. When it's actually time to molt, you may notice your tea has gone a very brown colour and made a strange flat web. This is the soft web they like to shed on. Very soon, it will be on its back molting. This is the time to leave your tarantula alone, as they feel very vulnerable. We stumbled across this Phlogis while we were flipping rubbish for snakes. We got a quick pick and decided to leave it alone.
Now we get to my favourite part of the talk, the biggest. There is still a debate on which Aussie teas are the biggest. We do know they probably come from the Phlogis family, as these species get huge. Steve and I believe there are a few species that can compete. I personally believe Phlogis blueleg, Phlogis crassipes get massive, but the longest would probably be Phlogis strenus, and the biggest would have to go to Phlogis Goliath. Both Strenus and Goliath can be found in Cape York Peninsula, usually in rainforest habitat and semi-dry woodland.
Some tarantula species are sexually dimorphic when it comes to size. Usually the male is small, lanky, and well, kinda ugly. Females can be a lot stockier in size and get much bigger. It is much easier to sex a T when they are adults. If you get a close enough look of the male's front pedipalps, closest to the fangs, you may notice a round stubby club-like bulge for the base of the foot. These are the male's sex organs. And if you get a close enough look on the male's front legs, you may also notice a hook that only the males have. I can just notice it in this picture. They use this hook to hold the female when mating. When a tarantula isn't fully grown, it can be hard to determine if it's male or female. This young T is a bit confusing. Can you tell if it's male or female? My guess is it's a female, but a sure way to tell is to check the molt, the most recent fresh molt.
A friend who lives overseas gave me this picture of a green bottle blue tarantula molt to help explain how to sex a tarantula. If you soak the molt in water and dish soap, you can gently fold out the abdomen, exposing the white-looking squares called book lungs. In between, you may notice it flat with a thin line. In this case, like in the picture, you have a male. But if there's more of a hole or more of a concave in this area I've circled here, try to see if there's a small flap. If there is, you have a female. This hole or concave I mentioned is where the female stores the sperm. While I've had no experience breeding Ts, Steve has had many successful pairs. The first thing he needs is what we call a prime male, a mature male with usually bright colours that's wandering around its enclosure ready to mate. Sometimes even making a sperm web signalling that it's ready to mate, as they make this web to store their sperm and transfer sperm to their pedipalps. Here's an example phone video of some breeding. Just look how tiny that male is. He pushes his front legs called pedipalps that store the sperm up into the female. He has to be very careful though, as the female can easily kill him and eat him if she's nervous or hungry. That is why Steve makes sure that the female is well fed before mating. You can see sometimes the male will tap the ground in a special way to signal that he is not food.
Male Ts live usually only up to 5 years, while the females can live up to 20 years. The time it takes to lay an egg sac after mating can vary from a few weeks to a few months. It isn't too long before the female has an egg sac. Steve preferred not to feed the female during this time, as not to cause any stress. He preferred letting the female take care of the sac, so not to stress her as well. In a few weeks, it isn't long before the slings hatch, and there are mini versions of the mother running around everywhere. At this point, we have the fun task of separating hundreds of them. When there can be up to 300 slings, this is really not a fun task.
While there have been some scientific studies on Australian teas, the majority still remain not properly identified. There is no easy way to find out how to ID an Aussie tea, so we go off location and what names are being used in the hobby. Hopefully one day there will be an in-depth description of each tarantula, but because of genetic diversity in so many different locations, this is very difficult.
There is still much to be studied on Australian tarantulas, as I'm sure there are plenty of new species out there. Here are just some species we couldn't ID that were found at the top of Cape York in far north Queensland. Hopefully one day the species can be properly researched and ordered correctly to give people a general idea of the Aussie teas. This of course requires funding to the scientists for research.
Alright, up next is Phlogis, a large one. This is one of my largest tarantulas. This is Phlogis strenus, the southern form. This is a female. There's a bit of mould growing in its enclosure, so I'm going to rehome it. Problem I seem to be getting a lot of. I try to keep the substrate a bit drier, but you still get it from time to time. It's always good to see if you can noodle it out. You can actually see it down the hole there. It's removing its tube that it lives in. Now it's all dirty. So this is an old girl, quite an old girl. You can see her abdomen slightly worn. She's big. The strenus, one of the biggest ones, probably just as long, not as heavy as the Goliaths. They're one of my favourites. They're not as fast as some of the others around. See if I can move it back into frame for the macro. You hear the whistle there. That's why they call them whistling spiders. Those fangs are longer than a lot of Australian snake fangs. Nearly a centimetre. You can see on the palps there's no claws. So definitely a female. Obviously as well by the size of this one and the size of the abdomen. Next up we got this rainforest scorpion. Common as anything. They like to play dead a lot. Let's get some macro of him. As with many scorpions, smaller the tail, bigger the claws, the less the venom. So that's why I'm handling him. I've had mozzie bites worse than the stings of these guys. Important with these scorps. Give them lots of water. They are a rainforest animal from the wettest parts of the jungle, so they like the water. Alright, up next we have my E-rub ripes. This is a massive centipede of mine. Tiger form. It's a female. She's dropped peedlings before. And she's about 17 centimetres long all up. You can't tell right now because she's burrowing. Especially with these guys, got to keep it nice and humid. So this is the Selena Tippus sterlingi, a true arid species from Central Australia, and as far as I'm aware, I'm the first one to have bred these in captivity. There's the Goliath, smashing its food.
Steve used to keep a large variety of inverts, and the main source of food he used was the common house cricket you can buy from most pet stores, as well as mealworms, and for the really big tarantulas, pinky mice.
Well, that wraps up the film, but before I go, I'd like to mention something really fascinating but gross when it comes to feeding teas. And you're probably all wondering why this last photo is of a gecko. Well, one time at my friend's house, they had a dog that killed one of these introduced Asian house geckos, so I decided to feed it to one of my tarantulas being still fresh, but now dead. The very next day, there was no gecko left at all, just a big, digested, gross slime ball. Pretty gross, right? But just goes to show how well spiders can break down their meal. They are fascinating inverts, that's for sure. And I hope you all enjoyed this presentation on Aussie teas, and hopefully you learned something. So check out our page on YouTube at Cold Blooded Cousins. Tack för att du tittade. Hej då!